if you're in a toxic relationship, if you've got relationship in which you're being abused in some way or exploited or continually devalued, there's some sort of defect in the imagination there. I'm not actually seeing you for who you are, which is convicting and hard. I mean, it's hard to maintain that. But I suggest that the reason we have a difficulty turning that face toward others is because we don't turn that face toward ourselves.
Hey guys, welcome back to another episode of The Naked Gospel. It is our hope and vision to see a revival of sexual integrity and dignity throughout the entire bride of Christ. I'm your host, Shane O'Neill. Today we are joined by Dr. Corey Latta. Dr. Latta has his PhD in literature. He's done a ton of work on C.S. Lewis and imagination. He wrote a book on it, actually, C.S. Lewis and the Art of Writing, which is just an incredible piece of work. Super thrilled to have him on. He is going to walk us through not just what imagination is in the philosophical sense, but also kind of the neurology of it. He also has the advantage of being a counselor, so he's going to help us see the actual practical kind of perversions of imagination, how it's used in a kind of a debased way, how we all function with it in broken ways, but then also how to use it to know Jesus, to interact with Jesus, and to see Jesus in creation. So super thrilled to have him on. Excited for the conversation. Thanks for joining us. Corey, round two, man. I was talking to Holly Ordway, Dr. Holly Ordway, a few weeks ago. She was telling me she did a 2-hour interview once, and then at the end, the guy realized that the whole thing wasn't recorded. I'm glad this blunder isn't as bad as that one. And she actually redid the entire thing. So appreciate you just jumping back on. First episode got deleted. I claim technical error, but my producer says, no, that's human error. That's his nice way of saying it's my fault. So we'll do our best to make this one count. And so thank you again just for joining us.
Happy to see your face again.
For sure. Last time it was your birthday, so it's not as monumental a day, but happy birthday yet again.
Thanks. Yeah. Appreciate that. Feels a little anticlimactic right now, but it's okay.
Yeah. Corey, tell us a little bit about who you are. Who is Dr. Corey Latta?
Yeah. So, where to start? I am a teacher and a writer. My background's in theology, and then I jumped ship and went to the world of literature. I got bit by the C.S. Lewis and Tolkien bug, and went on to do graduate degrees in lit. And always felt called to write. It's always been a passion of mine. So I've been writing poetry and got a few books out. C.S. Lewis, The Art of Writing is one of those. Working on a couple more. And there's a sort of a new iteration of my life or who I am. I'm finishing up a degree now to be in counseling, to be a therapist. So I'm just kind of this melding of worlds going on. And I think they fit nicely, but so I'm seeing clients and starting on that path as well.
Yeah, it's a pretty diverse journey from theology to literature to now counseling. That's rather cool, and I'm sure that you actually pull from all those resources in counseling. Probably ask questions around that later on, but I guess this is always a risky question. But do you lean either direction with Tolkien or Lewis? Do you have a favorite between the two?
I may lose half your listeners by answering this question.
Let's do it. What do you got?
I'm a Lewis guy, just because he captured my imagination first, I think.
Yeah.
So I just kind of felt, you know what it was for Lewis? It wasn't just, it was the rational, at the time when I encountered him, it was his ability to reason through arguments. And like most college students going into seminary, I was pretty much, I was in my head, I was living in my head. And I needed to know that my faith was tethered to something solid. So I read Mere Christianity, The Problem of Pain, Miracles, things like that. And it hit me at the right time.
Yeah.
Tolkien came around the same time, and he just appealed to something, I would say, deeper doesn't sound like a fair way to put it, but it might be the best word to use. He hit me in a deeper way.
Yeah.
I think Tolkien, and this is what everyone's experience with Tolkien is, he created a world for me to inhabit.
Yeah. Yeah.
So there's a real sense of place with Tolkien and finding a place in that story. So I love them both. It's hard to choose. I've made my dissertation, and you kind of have to pick a horse and ride it.
Yeah.
So Lewis was that horse.
Yeah.
But the older I get, though, Tolkien becomes more. I turn to Tolkien more for pleasure. I'll say that. So I don't know what that means. That was the most non-answer.
No, it's good. Yeah. It's Tolkien's Middle Earth like has so many genres within that world. Like he picks on like just poetry and epic and fantasy in different ways, and it really is a world within a world. Yep. You don't get so much of that in Narnia, but you do in the space trilogy with like, especially in the first book where the different cultures have different kind of mediums of engagement, whether it's like poetry or logic or whatever. So you get that in like a micro sense, but Tolkien's really the one who built that world out. So it makes sense that it's the one that you would inhabit or find, I guess, there's just a deeper, richer landscape. Whereas
there's more room. There's more room. The house is bigger.
Yeah, for sure. Okay. Well, this is a good segue into, Corey, what is imagination? How would you define imagination? How do you understand imagination?
Yeah. So on a biological level, imagination takes place. It's a neurological function.
Mm-hmm.
So you take in images. Those images are taken in and processed by the occipital lobe, which sits in the back of your brain. And then right beneath the occipital lobe is a parietal lobe. And it's responsible for what we would call the imagination. It creates these abstract kind of notions and forms. And then you're able to, once sort of processed, you're able to express. So it's this, in one sense, it's this God-given design function to see in things more than what meets the eye. There's not just a cloud, there's an elephant in a cloud or something like that. There's not just syntax, there's Middle Earth, right? You can take the constituent parts of something and create something more. Spiritually, I think, and emotionally and relationally, I'll throw all those together. I think it is the ability to see something for what it is, what it can be, and then it's got this energy to it, imagination does, this energy to cross that divide between what something is and what it can be, right? So we were just chatting about Lewis. When the Pevensey kids enter through the wardrobe and they're in Narnia, there's this real sense of like, where are we? And what's a strange place? But the Narnians, like Mr. and Mrs. Beaver and Tumnus, they're looking at the kids like, well, it's not, the question isn't where are you, it's who are you? And you're actually kings and queens of Narnia, you're sons of Adam, daughters of Eve, right? And they just don't understand that about themselves. Like, that's not my mom and dad's name. I mean, they know the biblical story and whatnot, but they're just 4 kids who have, had to kind of exile England because of the war and things like that. But the whole book is not just the story. It's obviously a story of Christ, but it's also this unfolding of identity. So imagination happens on sort of 2 planes. And I think there's a beautiful cognate to that in relationships, that part of what imagination is. There's the imagination that goes into, even when you write a book, right? If you create a novel, write a song, paint a painting, you're looking at some kind of medium. If I were to take this journal and it's somewhat blank and then write a novel on it, there is in one sense me taking something that is in one state and seeing more in it, more to it, and kind of pulling out or adding on, right, these other elements that create a new thing. So there's that artistically, but the same thing happens relationally. In one sense, it's the ability to see who you really are, who you're really made to be. And then there's it's like a dynamism, like a life force, an energy that allows that path to be, traversed, or that divide to be crossed.
Yeah. So what I hear you saying is that imagination has the ability or has the function of like laying this tapestry of meaning upon kind of the material that we look at. So whether that's a journal or a book or whatever, all of a sudden we fall into a world just by reading syntax. So I remember Dr. Holly Ordway, again, was, I think she was playing with Lewis's definition of imagination as kind of this meaning-making faculty or organ. Yeah. So it takes kind of the data that we have and then all of a sudden imbues it with meaning. Okay. So I'm understanding you right. So when it comes to, that strikes me as peculiar. It strikes me as peculiar mostly because of my upbringing. The word imagination, I was never like taught necessarily that it was a human faculty, more of like a perversion or a deviation of something like good. And so like when I became a Christian, the kind of the faculties of maybe like reason or conscience were given like much higher, if we use a fancy word, kind of epistemic authority, where like these are the things that you use to know Jesus, to know the world. And so imagination is typically associated with like fantasy or imaginary or fictitious. But what I hear you saying is that it's an actual faculty, and it actually has like it has a place of importance and meaning in our humanity. Is that fair to say?
Huge. And I, not to discount the hemisphere of the brain that's, control of rationality and things like that. I mean, it's a God given, Lewis says reason is the organ of truth, right? It's how we deduce what is true and what's not. Think about his trillogism, Jesus is a liar, a lunatic, or Lord. That's a kind of a syllogistic way to get to a truth, right?
Yeah.
But even to imagine Lord, like that concept. Well, what do you mean Lord? He's not like Lord in some sort of old English sense. So what are we talking about? Are we talking about the sovereignty of Christ over all the created known universe? That requires imagination. Like I have to be able to. I mean, the Bible is replete with this. When Paul talks about, I always reference this because I think it's one of the most beautiful moments in Scripture in terms of an expression of imagination. In Ephesians 2, he says, 1 and 2, he says to the church in Ephesus, you've been seated. It's an aorist tense verb, so it's a past tense verb. You've been seated with Christ in the heavenly realms, right? And reading that's obviously for us as well. It's like, well, I'm sitting in my, apartment and it's May, whatever, 2020. I'm not seated with Christ anywhere. What do you mean? And I have been seated? And Paul is able to say, because your relationship with Christ, there's this thing more true of you than what you experience. It's not just, your physical, it's not just you inhabiting a material world, right? So it's this imbuing of meaning that I think kind of gets to the heart of it. So yeah, we can know facts and data and stats. Those are important and God-given, and we need that faculty. But nothing's they just won't mean anything. Think about the cross itself. I'm talking about just like the cross. Rationally, it's a horizontal and a vertical line, just kind of put together, right? The power of the cross is metaphorical, and cognate for metaphor would be imagination. Like this is an imaginative, not fictitious. There's a difference there, right? We're not even talking about fantasy in some ways. We can parse those out, but like we imagine or see into the greater meaning of that symbol.
Yeah,
we can't take it just logically and literally. It won't. It's emptied of its power when we do that.
I remember Eugene Peterson was talking about parables, and he said that the power of parables is that they're stories we all know, and truth is hidden within them. So all of a sudden, Jesus invites people into these stories where they can, again, to use your word, inhabit kind of seamlessly, because they're stories about their everyday. And then all of a sudden they find themselves within the kingdom, or they find themselves being sowed with a seed of the kingdom. And so he uses the phrase that parables are subversive, right? They all of a sudden use our imagination to get past the gatekeeper, so to speak. And then all of a sudden we find ourselves within the kingdom looking from the inside out.
Yeah, it's good. Yeah. Peterson's phenomenal. He's a phenomenal writer of the imagination. I mean, he hits on these things all the time. So like, and it's interesting, when disciples ask Jesus, why do you talk in parables? He sort of says, well, it's kind of to sift out who's in and who's out.
Yeah.
And you can imagine that those who walked away are probably those who are just a little too wooden in their thinking.
Yeah.
They sort of had this Torah mindset in which you just, well, I do this and I do that and I do this. And this experiential notion of God, the way Jesus presents the kingdom, it was this, this kind of almost myth making, not myth in the fictitious sense, but myth in the grand story sense. This myth making was just baffling to them. They just couldn't quite get it. I mean, so when he speaks in metaphor, hey, you're going to have to eat my flesh and drink my blood in John 6, and they all turn away because like, this is too hard for us. Like, we're out. He knows what he's doing. And I think he's calling on a deeper part of who we are to know him, because this alone just is not going to, we'll be a bunch of literal Pharisees.
Yeah. Yeah. Do you see, well, yeah, do you see any connection between imagination and us being humans made in the image of God? What kind of connection would you see with, so image of God, we'll probably use the phrase imago Dei quite a bit, and they're just synonyms for each other. So when it comes to the imago Dei, the image of God upon us, what do you see any connection there with imagination?
Yeah. So let me redeem my, if I besmirch Tolkien at all, I'm going to redeem him now. Tolkien has this great concept of subcreation, and Dr. Ordway may have touched on this. So the idea is that God is the arch creator, right? And we are lesser creators. When we say we are the bearers of the imago Dei, or made in the image of God, like so get my journal. If I were to I'm going to draw a little stick man here. You could say that like that is, in one sense, an image of Corey. Not that this little guy reflects me, but it is the product. It's an image, right, from my mind, and that's what we mean. I mean, we literally are Paul says in Ephesians 2:10, you are the poema, the workmanship. That phrase workmanship and craftsmanship doesn't quite get at it. The Greek phrase is poema. We are his poetry, created in Christ Jesus to do good works.
That's beautiful.
Yeah, so the idea is like we are God's novel. He's creating these characters and writing these things in us and through us and with us. So when I express imagination, I am, in one sense, when we first meet God in Scripture, what do we see? If you just had Genesis 1 and 2, and that's all the revelation of God you had, you maybe could deduce that he's a loving God, he's in a relationship with the us part, right, and all that. But the one thing you would have clearly is that he's a creator. He's an image maker. He births things, right? We express our image, I think, most, I don't know if you want to say explicitly or strongly or primarily, but most when we take on that creative function, when we create. So in a sense, everything we create is just an echo of his act of creativity, and which never ends. I mean, he's constantly creating, through and around us.
Yeah, that's a deeper look at imago Dei than we typically get in theological examinations of that Genesis 1 in particular. Typically, it's just dominion and reproduction, and sometimes they're two-dimensional. Sometimes it's not just the words, but sometimes there is go out and be fruitful, multiply, and exercise dominion. But the three-dimensional, them being able to inhabit it, can get a little bit murky, and sometimes people don't really hit on that. I think people have rightly pointed out that kind of a cultural mandate in there, and you do see you do see naming coming out of there. You see even metallurgy, you see song. And it seems to kind of hit a crescendo with Noah building this ark, this just great engineering process of imagination. So you do see it if you're actually looking for it. But most of the time, that isn't a filter on the lens that I use when I examine the Imago Dei or the Genesis. That imagination is significant. I think I think that's to our detriment, because I would argue that lust entirely uses imagination for engagement. Like, to lust, I mean, you're imagining yourself interacting with this individual. You're imagining pleasure. You're imagining maybe even a life or a name or whatever. But fantasy is at its worst in those moments of lust. So that would be maybe my communication of how I see imagination. I talked a little bit about how imagination has maybe been neglected, but then also how it's being abused. How would you articulate maybe the abuse of imagination, or how you see imagination being misused? Just some of the awful ways that imagination can be used.
Yeah, I think I want to protect the term imagination, but it's kind of just a game of semantics. So I would say that imagination, if we're in keeping with the image of God, imagination is something that takes us into inhabitation and responsibility, and fantasy is something that brings us out of habitation and responsibility.
I see what you're saying. Yeah, the distinction's interesting.
So imagination builds something in which I need to inhabit. Fantasy almost always pulls me out of that which I inhabit.
That's good, dude.
And there's a literary function, or a film function to fantasy that is fine, because the thing we're escaping to, like Tolkien talks about, a function of fantasy is escape. The thing I'm escaping to might be worthy. And we can talk about what is worthy and what's not and all that. But as a creator or a user of the imagination, I have to be really careful that the thing I'm escaping to has a sense of worth. And the way I know that is it's all just projection of what I know to be here, right? I mean, it's got to reflect and be an extension of virtues that I already hold to. I mean, we're not creating any new abstract truths.
Yeah.
Beauty is beauty, is goodness is, truth is truth. And we can debate what those mean, but
excuse me.
Fantasy almost always pulls you out of those things. Imagination puts you into those things. So like a sexual relationship can be a place of knowing and intimacy and struggle and vulnerability. Pleasure is going to be in there. It can be those things. It also can just be a place in which you're literally investing in the other person and trying to get to deeper aspects of that personality, even through the sex act, right?
Yeah.
Fantasy, though, is an exploitation and an emptying of those things for usury, basically. I mean, like, you're just sort of, it's just pillaging.
Yeah. The pillaging is a good word for it, honestly. Even something as strong as like predatorial. Like, there is this preying act, especially with pornography, where you're going out to find something to consume only for your own satiation. You certainly see pieces of that in hookup culture, where people we're developing a culture of sex addicts, but we're also, I think people are also addicted to the challenge, to the praying, to the seeking, to like, can I get her, or can I get him? And so there is this, you're swiping to find which one you want. And then you go out, into the jungle, so to speak. And then you go and you prey on them and you get them, and then you're done. And then you leave, right? It's not like you bring them home to your family and make them part of your family. You leave them out there as just a corpse that you've used and you've discarded. And so there is this real, I like the language. It elicits a lot of, it elicits a lot of helpful imagery. So I appreciate you bringing it up. Let's see. I want to jump into, we've definitely looked a lot at some of the deviations from imagination. We've also looked at what imagination is, part of the Imago Dei, part of our humanity. Imagination. So you'd say imagination being misappropriated is fantasy. Is that fair to say?
Yeah, and I'm not. Yeah, and I'm. I want to be careful not to cast aspersions on fantasy as a literary function or something like that. Right? That's not what I mean at all.
Yeah.
But this exploitative, emptying out of the self and using of another self.
Yeah, I hear you saying fantasy in almost a neutral way. It can be used in really bad ways, but then there also is like a way you can utilize it that is very beautiful and redemptive. Yeah. Okay.
Yep.
Okay.
Right.
Okay. So when it comes to actually engaging imagination to know Jesus, engaging imagination to know, because it's not. So imagination, we're almost talking about it in a kind of abstract way because. Well, one, because there's probably novelty to this conversation, but also because, well, it's big. It's like meaning making, and it's like, well, what does that mean? Does that mean meaning is subjective? And so when it comes to knowing Jesus with imagination, how would you engage that where people do? I guess a fear that I have inside of me right now is that people could still be listening to the conversation and say, well, that still sounds fictitious. So then how then would you use imagination to not just create meaning, but also know meaning? I remember Peter Kraft had said that two things humans can do that no other creature can do is wonder and weep, So like even something like that is fascinating to me. And it helps me to know then that that's an aspect of my Imago Dei that I should pay attention to, wondering and weeping, but wondering and weeping in a way that's wholesome and beautiful, because we can wonder and weep over some really awful things. But like using those things to know Jesus.
Yes. We don't mean that we are creating Jesus in our own image or, putting something onto the person of Christ that isn't already revealed to us or anything like that. We stand in the tradition of the biblical authors when we do this. I mean, like Ezekiel's vision of God, where he just can't explain what's happening. He says it's a wheel. God appears to him as this wheel within a wheel. Like that's wholly imaginative language because he can't how do you make sense of the divine, really? Other than the person of Christ. And this is why the incarnation had to happen. I mean, like for the infinite to be known by the finite, it's got to take on finitude, right?
Yeah.
So, there's this sense in which I can only grasp and grope through the language given to me, and I don't know what to do. If you imagine trying to describe a theophany. So Isaiah is like, well, I see a temple and I see the train of his robe fill it, and you go to, of course, Daniel or Revelation, and it's nothing but meaning making or metaphor making. And there's one sense in which I don't know you're not going to deduce your way there. Like you're not God is not the major conclusion of a syllogism. Facts about him are right. So there's that. And the other thing is, I don't know, to have relationship with Christ requires, I want to be careful how I phrase this. So you tell me, take all realms of all intellectual disciplines, all kind of realms of knowledge, bring it to bear on this question of how, number one, God could become man. Let's like that aside, right? But that the blood of that God man, the physical blood, the material blood, could somehow atone for the immaterial sins of all humanity, past, present, and future. That's just not a rational proposition. Now, someone's going to argue with me and say, well, it is rational if the blood of that God man is the blood of God himself and it's infinitely powerful. And sure, I get all that. Yeah. I still don't know how this particular bodily material, the substance, a fluid, translates into the redemption of something so immaterial. For all, I don't know how that works. I believe it. I feel the power of it.
Yeah.
But it requires some kind of you're going to have to flex a muscle, right? Bigger and stronger than your rationality there. So there is this sense in which you have to suspend disbelief or project belief into this is what faith is. Like I can't, the reason atheists get hung up on this is because they can't, I don't think they have the imaginative capability they're just sort of looking at it all materially and it doesn't add up. yeah, it just looks, it's just kind of ludicrous, right?
Yeah.
But if you imagine again who God is and how He sort of set this thing up, then you can kind of get there. So, and also I'll say this: imaginative prayer. Some of our, your listeners may be familiar with it. So, imaginative prayer is a long time throughout the history of the church, a long time practice, and it's basically just imagining Christ spatially in one sense. So, like St. Patrick's, Christ before me, Christ beside me, Christ behind me, that kind of thing. Um, the Hebrew scriptures do this all the time. That God is a strong tower, and the righteous run in and are safe. I mean, like metaphor making galore in the Psalms, right?
Yeah.
So that's part of what we mean too. It's what are ways we can talk about God without just sort of saying quite literally the being higher than which exists no other being,
Yeah. Yeah. So when I was going through counseling for a whole slew of issues, but one of them at the time was pornography. I recall the guy I was doing counseling with, at the end of every session, he'd hand me this really beat up looking cross, and Jesus is barely clothed, because he probably actually wasn't clothed at all when it actually happened. Like, there's nothing more sobering than a naked man dying on a cross for you. That is the counter image to pornography in its own way. Nothing screams turn off like a naked man dying on a cross for you. So he would hand me this cross with this just beat up looking Jesus, and he would have me stare at it. And then at the end, when I was done staring at it, he would have me say, Jesus, make me the man you died to redeem. Right. So like this image would sear itself into my imagination, into my soul. And we talked a little bit before about Visio Divina, where you use a specific image as a means of prayer and interacting with Jesus. And so that was its own kind of Visio Divina, where you're using a visual to interact with the divine, with God. And that image just like it would start to form me into the man that I long to be, that Jesus died to redeem. And a lot of like shame and things like that would come up, and like just being able to place it on the cross that I was actually looking at, not like, again, it's not imaginary, but I am using imagination to know the meaning, to discover, to excavate the meaning of the cross. And of course I don't understand it, to your point, like I didn't understand it, but it was happening nonetheless. And that was very significant in my own healing and in my own development as a human being and knowing redemption with Jesus.
Yeah, and that all translates to our relationships too. I mean, I think I said this our first round. All abuses in relationships, emotional, spiritual, relational, communicative, all devaluing of people is essentially a defect in the imagination. It's me not seeing you for who you really are. Lewis's The Weight of Glory. You've never met a mere mortal. If I'm going to get off looking at porn, they certainly don't. These paid, severely wounded porn actresses, like I certainly don't see them as immortal.
Yeah,
it would be hard to engage in that act if I imagine them to be who they really are, to see them for who they really are, which Lewis says in The Weight of Glory, are they these eternally kind of angelic creatures, these sort of gods and goddesses, or these devilish nightmares, because of the state of their souls. That's something I suspend that belief to engage in pornography, and so it comes out of my own shame. I obviously don't have enough imagination for myself, because that's truly, that is beneath you. That is beneath me. We are too good for that. So same thing, if you're in a toxic relationship, if you've got a relationship in which you're being abused in some way or exploited or continually devalued, there's some sort of defect in the imagination there. I'm not actually seeing you for who you are, which is convicting and hard. I mean, it's hard to maintain that. But I suggest that the reason we have a difficulty turning that face toward others is because we don't turn that face toward ourselves. So like we were talking before about there's these like you were talking about for like hookup culture. It's not just like the
Yes.
experience. It's not just the orgasm.
Right.
It's the process. It's called process addiction. It's the process of getting to that place. All that though is an extension of some kind of belief about oneself that is just base. So like a sex love addict, there are a few characteristics. And the first one is self-image. Someone who's given to that kind of addiction basically believes that their self-image is crap. Like I'm a unworthy bad person. Now, if you believe that, why not look at porn? Or why not run through, countless partners?
Yeah.
If you don't see yourself as more valuable than that. So that really bursts all these other characteristics. Another one is because they don't see themselves, this has been my journey and my struggle my whole life, because I don't see myself as valuable, my relationships are emptied of value. So I don't love me. No one could really love me. If people really knew me, they're going to leave me. They're not going to, take care of me, that kind of belief. So there's a self-image issue, and then this relationship issue. And from that comes this relationship to needs. The sex and love addict typically believes that his or her needs will not be met by another person ever, because no one cares. So they have to take care of themselves. And this is what pornography is: self-sufficiency, run amok. I'm just got to take care of myself, take care of myself, take care of myself. Whatever I'm feeling, I need to not feel. And this is the way I not feel, And then that all translates into this kind of reptilian belief that sex is the biggest and greatest need there is. Because everything else has been shut down. Like, you don't have any sense of worth or emotional bonding or anything like that. So instead of sex being this confluence of value and need and expression, and it just becomes the last resort to give you this short sort of hit of, gratification instead of satisfaction in the most human sense,
Corey, that's really good. I actually want to ask you to expound even a bit more on that, because we typically don't use the scriptures this way, or look at this verse this way. So love the Lord your God with all your heart, strength, soul, and mind, and love your neighbor as you love yourself. We typically just, for some reason, love your neighbor, right? So it's like love God, love neighbor, but love your neighbor as you love yourself. And in 1 John, it says, we love God because he first loved us. And so if I'm having an issue loving God or loving neighbor, it's because I'm having an issue realizing why God loves me. Yep. Right. And so like there are plenty of times where when I'm struggling to love God, I don't just try and like muscle it up. I had for years, but now I just pray, God, I'm missing a way in which you love me. Can you show me how you love me? Right. And just like this posture and invitation to be loved by God, because he does. And I'm missing something. It's not like a lack of devotion or a lack of like just white knuckling it, because like I've tried that so many times, and it's man, I always hit the pavement that way, but like just laying down on the pavement instead and just saying, God, here I am, pick me up and love me. It's that invitation to be loved. Can you play that out? Because shame, I mean, we talk about guilt a lot, especially in theology with like penal substitution, but like shame in and of itself is like, I've heard psychologists define guilt as feeling bad for something you've done, and shame as feeling bad for who you are. Yeah, it's like this identity thing. So are you able to play that out a little bit more and speak in any of that?
Yeah, I think, I tell guys all the time. So, I label myself as a sex love addict. That's been my entire relational story. A lot of pain, a lot of wounds. And it all starts in childhood. We don't have time to kind of get into that, but it really does. It just does. Those wounds are inflicted early. But I tell guys, so from my own experience, I've come to work with a lot of guys who have sex addictions. And I tell them all the time, you're not addicted to porn, you're addicted to shame. You just can't. And you're like, who wants to be addicted to that?
Man.
Well, no one wants to be, but you just simply can't rise above yourself. You don't have the means on your own. This is why all recovery starts with, you have the admission of powerlessness. It's the prodigal son story, right? He's cast away here and he has to come to himself.
Yeah.
Which is to say, I'm broke. I got nothing. And then the bargaining begins, but that's also shame, right? I'll just go back and be a slave in my father's house. And the beauty of the prodigal son is, no, you're going to be accepted as a son again, and actually you're going to get some benefits of the sonship that you've never known before because you admitted your powerlessness. So the addiction to shame is really this cycle, this kind of closed circuit of not being able to see oneself as for who you really are, and therefore not being able to act as one more meaningful and worthy than who you think you are. So it takes a lot of work on that shame piece to be able to even touch here's the thing, sex addiction is not the problem. And if Christians could hear this, my gosh, we would see I think a huge shift in the struggle here. Porn isn't the problem. It's just a symptom. It's like someone who drinks too much. The alcoholism isn't the problem. It is a problem, obviously, but it's not the problem. It is simply a symptom. It is the top of the iceberg. It's the 10% you see. The 90s, no one gets up and says, you know what, today I'm going to have an affair and destroy my family, and I'm going to get drunk, and I'm going to drink myself into oblivion and lose my job. Like, no one does that. What they're doing is simply acting out of a low, emptied out sense of self, which is so deeply ingrained because they've come to believe it over decades, years, right? So you got to address the shame piece, the guilt piece. And I would say a heavily shamed person probably actually doesn't even know guilt anymore. You could do something, pretty severe to tap into some temporary guilt, but that shame is so. The reason it's like, it'd be like this: guilt would be a flashlight and shame would be the sun. Like, yeah, I may be sort of waving my flashlight around, but here's this one thing I did, but you're not even gonna be able to discern the light coming from it because the sun is so bright, right? When the shame is so loud in someone's life, everything is sort of consumed by it. All things, guilt translates right into toxic shame. It just heaps on more shame. And we can't live that. You cannot live that kind of shame. You're either, point people to one of my favorite authors, Ernest Hemingway. It's like, well, you're going to do one of two things. You're going to take, if you're a character in Hemingway's story, you're going to, and this is what Hemingway himself did. You're either going to try everything under the sun to see if you can get some kind of relief from the sense of being not enough, this toxic shame. You're going to drink yourself into oblivion, or you're going to kill yourself. Like, you're going to turn to something to numb yourself into some sort of existential coma, or you're just going to kill yourself. And Hemingway ultimately killed himself. I mean, this is where this leads. So we can't live with that kind of shame. We've got to have some sort of antidote to it. The short-sighted, learned way in which we try to take care of that shame is simply to numb it and to grasp for any kind of validation or affirmation that we can, which porn gives the illusion of, right?
Yeah.
There's a lot more to say there, but there's a
No, that was awesome. Addiction to shame isn't ever really talked about. Even like addicted to the closed circuit lifestyle of shame. I think that's significant. Sorry, I'm trying to metabolize it. Yeah, I think that goes a long way. Because once you can diagnose that issue, then the gospel makes a whole lot more sense. There's nothing worse than somebody who's ill who doesn't think they're ill, And I saw there's some ethicists and psychologists, sociologists. They've been talking recently about how we're starting to shift as a culture from the penal idea of guilt and vindication to more of an honor shame because of the kind of social media we engage in, where people feel shame and feel honor, and it has nothing to do with the legal system, but is becoming a part of their day in and day out. And if that's starting to be discovered now from some of the current technology, and porn's been around for a while, longer than that, then that means that shame has been a part of our reality under the current of it all for a lot longer than sociologists are even aware of. So, and that's certainly true. I think what you're saying doesn't just apply to pornography, but as you noted, to the adulterer, to hookup culture. No one necessarily plans to go and wreck their marriage, yet it happens, and it typically happens repeatedly. It's not It's not just a one and done.
Because the thing you're running from isn't ever addressed, right?
Yeah.
So you can start to address that. What's like an overworker? Like we never think about this, but I know some really some pillars in the church who are just slaves to their hustle, their jobs, and they don't understand. And they'll even like cite scripture about being diligent and storing up and all this stuff, but they don't understand that the same thing that drives the narcotics abuser or the porn user is what drives them.
Yeah.
They've got to outrun the emptiness they feel. Oh. And they cannot sit with themselves as being normal or the last thing we really want to come to terms with is our normalcy, like just the mundane nature of our existence. This kind of goes back to the nature of the fall, right? And what Satan is probably kind of the apple he's dangling before us is, hey, there's a little more going on here, and you don't have to, and porn gives us that for a sense, like for a second, like there is this sense in which, and then there's this dopamine release, and we're playing into the reward system that gives this sort of temporary feeling of invincibility, and that's very addictive. So there's neuroplasticity to take into account and all that. But on an emotional level, it's this real sense of exhilaration that takes me out of this bland, mundane existence that I live in every day. So until you can empty the shame out of your existence and the shame out of yourself, and come to terms with the fact that you're here. Samuel Beckett, the great 20th century Irish playwright, says, "You're on earth and there's no cure for that." Like, you got to come to terms with that. And if you can accept that and start to live on those terms, then you can kind of regain some perspective and like, you know what, not so bad. And that's a healthy thing. I mean, so much of scripture is about that. I mean, Paul says things like leading a quiet life, and people like Tolkien, who the idyllic form of existence is living in a shire and planting green things your whole life. You know what I mean? Like, it's not a bad thing, but it takes a long time, man. I mean, my struggle was I couldn't stand that. I was made for more than that, I thought, and just kicking against the goads of normalcy. Yeah. Life will win. Like, life will win. The hammer of life, God will wield it in such a way until you either are broken by it or you submit to it.
Pain is God's megaphone. Yeah. Okay. So we're off topic. It's and off script in a lot of ways. We didn't actually talk about a lot of this in the last one, but I think this trail is rather important. So what I hear you saying is that we all carry around a crap ton of shame, and that shame eats us alive, and the jacked up behaviors that we see are the symptoms of that shame that we host. So it kind of necessitates the question then, what is the remedy for the shame? You were talking earlier about how God isn't a syllogism. I like Dr. Peter Kreeft's work on suffering here, because his entire work kind of gets to this point where he says that the problem of suffering isn't a syllogism. It's experiential, like it touches all of our lives. And so, of course, we're struggling to find a syllogistic answer or some kind of logical answer to this problem. And so he says, does God have a response to the problem of suffering? And he says, yes, because it's experiential, God gave us himself and experienced suffering with us. And so that's the answer to the problem of evil. And the problem of suffering is a God who experiences suffering and evil so that he can associate with us, kill it, and then make all things new, right? To promise to make all things new, which I absolutely love. I loved that engagement. How would you because like dopamine binging and just like going and going and going, like pornography, like no one watches just one video, like they binge on it for hours, and they create this amalgamation, this hybrid out of all sorts of different women or all sorts of different men, and then they get off to it eventually. but it's like, it's never just one video. And so we're just binging on the stuff. And so I guess I'm interested to know then how to practice stillness, how to practice abiding, because that is for me the hardest spiritual formation. Like I can like read scripture, I can memorize scripture, I can go serve the poor, whatever. But when it comes to actually like Sabbath, like typically like Sabbath is understood if it's regarded at all, it's like, oh, a day where I like can veg out and just watch TV with my wife or whatever. But like actually being still and knowing that he is God is what I hear you pointing us towards, and like Jesus coming and carving out that shame. But how do you engage that personally? But then also, how do you help people move towards that, whether it's people you're counseling or just things you've thought through?
Yeah, well, I would start and say, like, I suck at Sabbath. I mean, I just do. I just gave a talk for the Ansem Society. We had to record it and like upload it and all that. And I was talking about not always seeing yourself as the hero and the journey. Like that's important to see yourself on a journey, but to maybe shift to seeing the journey fit for you instead of you fit for it. And one thing, once you shift to the actual like life is happening, the way I ended that talk was the beautiful stanza from Whitman: "The powerful play goes on, and you can contribute a verse, that you may contribute a verse." So when you shift to the powerful play and think a little less maybe about the verse you contribute, there's a sense of rest that happens, because so much of my addiction is it's shame and the attempt to overcome shame through frenetic activity. I want to outwork it and outrun it. And, so I'm working so hard just to try to create something that gives me a sense of meaning or affirmation and validation. Right. So if you can cultivate rest, you can get to, that you can approach the antidote, to shame. But how do you do that? I think I don't have all the definitive answers on this for sure, but one thing that I have found immensely helpful is to put myself around things greater than myself. I tell guys all the time, if you're standing in front of the Mona Lisa or, some beautiful work of art or listening to a symphony, you're not going to lust. You're just probably not. Like it just doesn't, that's a thought that's going to come later or whatever. Like I've never been enthralled by something greater than myself and then thought about getting off or something like that. It's just not, to make that, which I think is what Sabbath is partly. It is this, let me put myself in the path of beauty and through rest by acknowledging, and it's peace, it's shalom, right? By acknowledging that life is, and it's beautiful and it's enough, and just sort of to take in, it's a time for receptivity instead of assertion. So taking in art, watching good movies, listening to music, creating, just an expansion of being, if I could put it that way, I think is a kind of antidote to the frenetic activity that shame usually produces. Shame can go the other way and create this kind of apathy and depression in which you don't do anything. But I would make the argument that you're always going to do something. It's just going to be some sort of addictive behavior, right? Like pornography or something like that. But I think I've got to put myself in, this goes back to imagination and fantasy. What am I being? Sabbath is resting in something, right? Fantasy, and it's worthy and noble. Fantasy is an escape to something, not a rest, and an assertive escape to something that is, inherently unworthy. And what we're trying to do there, you talked about binging, and it occurred to me as you were talking, I thought, yeah, you're right. I mean, this is insatiable, more and more and more. It feels like what we're trying to do, in piling these images up is almost create family. It's like, and I don't think that's off, because if you if you pay attention to trends in pornography, which is important for understanding what's happening in our psyches, like one of the most popular themes or trends in porn now is incest porn. It's the playing
Yeah.
out of family relationships
Yeah.
that transgress into, sexual relationship. That's not insignificant. Like there's something to that. If we want to understand what's going on in the hearts and minds of men and women who indulge themselves in these things, and that genre of pornography is what sort of the tip of the spear. Like you need to, we can't just sort of say, hey, don't do that. Like you need to understand what's appealing about that. There's something going on there.
Mm.
And I think there's this desperate need to create a family in which you have a place and a belonging and a mattering. And so the antidote to that would be to understand your need for it, to understand your feeling of not having it, and to begin to engage in it in real life and fellowship and cultivating relationships and friendships. And um, yeah, that's a lot, but
No, that was great. Somehow you took our veer off the trail, brought it back on, and made up for all the distance. So thank you. This was really helpful. It connects well with the conversation with Dr. Ordway, because she said if we're using this to avoid, or if we're using this to escape, it necessitates the question, what are we trying to avoid, or what are we trying to escape? And like those questions alone, like are haunting for me. Like they're haunting for me because I don't know, man. There are just times where I know that I'm intentionally avoiding being still because like I am afraid of what I'll see. Yeah. And so like that's why that practice with that counselor was so helpful for me, because when I looked at the cross, it wasn't just like showing me my shame in the sense of like, you put me here, like Jesus saying, you put me here, but he's saying, I know what you feel like. I've got you. Like, I am with you in your shame. Look how shamed I am. And I love you. Like, I did this for you, And so like that kind of like, I was reading recently that Jesus in the Synoptic Gospels is described a lot of different ways, but only at one point does he describe himself. And that's when he says, come to me, all you who are weary and heavy laden, and I will give you rest, for I am gentle and humble in spirit. Right. So Jesus described a lot of ways in the Synoptic Gospels, but like that's the only time Jesus describes what he's like. And so like learning to see a God or a Jesus and a God that are primarily gentle and humble in spirit, like that's approachable, because like I get into that space and I'm like, it's not safe. Like I don't want to turn on the light in that room because I have no idea what I'll see. And so I binge, I avoid, I whatever. But knowing a Jesus who is both gentle and humble, he goes in, he's got like a dimmer switch, so it's not all at once. He's not going to blind me, but he's like very present in that process. And like, that's the kind of God that I need to like actually do that kind of excavation, that kind of exploration. And fortunately, it's the kind of God that we have, which is really rad, So I love what you're saying, and it's helpful for me. Yeah, it's really helpful for me. All right. Corey, any final thoughts? I mean, we've been all over the place, but it's been really just so good. I even like some of the questions that I have. I'm like, oh, we answered a lot of those. I mean, the last question would have been like, how do Christians engage imagination to know Jesus redemptively? And like you even were talking a lot about intentionally getting lost in wonder. Whether you're like going and seeing these things. And I think that's probably part of the dissonance we have when we go to like something like the beach, because like we can get lost in the ocean because it's vast and bigger than us, clearly, while at the same time there are like naked people all around us, and so like there's like that weird dissonance where you see kind of like that sacred space of wonder that's been given to us for wonder getting hijacked, for the flesh. And I feel that kind of dissonance when I go to the beach. So like I appreciate what you're saying, because I do long for that wonder to see a story that's actually bigger than me and not contingent upon me. Any final thoughts on engaging imagination, knowing Jesus in imagination?
Yeah, I would say just that. You've got to be intentional to put yourself in the path of what is true, what is good, what's beautiful. You got to. It's got to be a daily practice. I'm a huge movie buff, and that's one of the reasons why. And then even if to those listeners out there who don't see themselves as creative, that's not true. You are. Like, we are sub creators, all creative in one way or the other. And I think to engage in creativity, acts of creativity and imagination, is hugely helpful for your sense of agency and purpose and your worthiness. It does get to the shame issue. And also, it just rewires the brain literally toward things that are more constructive rather than and progressive rather than destructive and regressive.
Yeah.
So
Mm.
as far as, practices, the practice of the imagination, make some images. I mean, we're talking about imagination as the birthing of image, right? So put yourself around the imagistic and be a creator of the imagistic.
Mm. Yeah, I love that. And I love how broad you're even allowing imagination to be, where in a sense, it's like even the act of making food is artistic and an act of imagination. And therefore, Jesus wants to know us in those moments, and we can actually worship him as we make by making food, not in like some kind of like stop and you have to sing some kind of worship song, but just delighting in that process. I appreciate that a lot. I think that's significant. So yeah, how would you, okay, so I guess I could understand maybe an objection at this point where somebody says, well, I don't really know how to make any images. Like, what do you mean by making images, Corey?
Yeah. Yeah, sure. Well, I even hobbies. Hey, do you fish? Like, do you like to paint? Even try some stuff too. I mean, going back to the Genesis mandate to kind of go and cultivate, and we are given to adventure. I mean, like this life is given to us as a journey and a quest. I mean, like go on it, do something, get involved in a class of some sort. Even if you can't do anything else but go for a walk. I mean, that's you are literally making a kind of space for yourself there. In a sense, if you're aware enough, all of life is a kind of ongoing act of creation. You are making something all the time. I remember in college we had this class that the final, like at the end of the semester, we had the professor hosted a dinner, and we had this big meal made, and we all ate and all that. And then he said, okay, now we're going to clean the table and wash the dishes. So we hand washed the dishes and set the table again, back to its pristine state. And he said, does anyone see what we just did? And we were all like, no, we just kind of, cleaned your house, bro. And he said, we just made something new. We just renewed, like we redeemed. It was a mess. It was used, and now it's back to its original state. That's making, but it requires in a kind of when I clean my extremely cluttered apartment, like that's making. If you just journal, anyone could do that. Like if you journal, you are in an act of creativity there. So I mean, like in one sense, all of life is an act of creating. Work is an act of creating.
That's really good, Corey. Corey, thanks for being with us today, man. This has been really fun and helpful. And somebody had said when the first recording that we did when it got canceled, a friend said to me, they said, well, I guess that one was just for you, Corey, and Jesus. And at the time I was like, you're probably right. And that's the last thing I want to hear right now. Like, don't tell me that. But like going through this and seeing certain threads that we didn't pick up last time. Just thankful to Jesus for you. Thank you for being with us again. Easy to see his hand in the midst of it. If people want to continue to track with your thoughts, how can they do that? I know you've written actually a few books, maybe like a starting spot if they wanted to get engaged with some of your thoughts.
Yeah. So I've got some books on Amazon. For the non-writers or for the writers, maybe a good place to start with some active creating imagination is my book, C.S. Lewis and the Art of Writing. It's meant to help initiate people into the life of the imagination, really, in the work of creativity. It's written with all these prompts in mind and all that. I've got a couple other books there that people can see if you're interested. One partly on superheroes and it's on superheroes. I co-wrote that, and then another on time, the theology of time, and people like T.S. Eliot and C.S. Lewis. And then I've got some pieces published here and there. I've got I'm on social media, Instagram, Facebook. I'm not I've never gotten on the Twitter bus. I've got a website that's just, I said this last time, like I'm just been sitting forever, and I'm so slothful as to get this thing going. But it's called For the Time Being, and it's going to be a place where I want to blog and put my pieces up there and maybe do some video stuff, but it doesn't exist. So maybe, be on the lookout.
I like it, man. I like it a lot. We'll, the one or two of your books will be in the show notes, so we'll make sure that's there as well. Corey, thank you for being with us, man. Really cool just to be with you, dude.
Yeah. Appreciate it.
Thanks, brother. Guys, if you are listening in, leave us a review. That would help a ton. This is also recorded. It's on YouTube, so if you want to check that out, that'll be in the show notes. You can go view it. If you are viewing this, then a thumbs up helps a lot. Also, in the comments, let us know folks you would love for us to interview, folks you'd love to be on here. We are always looking out for that, and we take a lot of direction from you guys. So check it out, subscribe, continue to track with us, and we will catch you next time.